One of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi's 5 children became a lifelong political claimant. Another withdrew so completely that decades could pass with barely a public word from her. The eldest built a life in Switzerland. The 2 youngest died far from Iran, one in a London hotel and the other in a Boston home. And then, 7 months after one of those deaths, a daughter was born who would never meet her father. The Iranian Revolution ended the Pahlavi monarchy in a matter of weeks. For the Shah's children, however, the revolution did not end when the throne disappeared. It followed them into schools, marriages, political campaigns, private grief, and the question none of them could fully escape. What does it mean to inherit a dynasty when the country that created it no longer recognizes it? To understand what happened to the 5 children, it helps to begin with something that is easy to forget. They were not one generation in the ordinary sense. The Shah's eldest daughter, Shahnaz, was almost 20 years older than his youngest son and 30 years older than his youngest daughter. She came from a different marriage, a different royal world, and almost a different Iran. Shahnaz Pahlavi was born in 1940, the only child of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and his first wife, Fawzia, an Egyptian princess and sister of King Farouk. The marriage connected 2 Middle Eastern royal houses, but it did not last. By the time the Shah married Farahnaz in 1959, Shahnaz was already a young woman. The 4 children most closely associated with the final years of the monarchy came from that third marriage. Reza was born in 1960 and, because he was a son, became the long-awaited heir. Farahnaz followed in 1963. Ali Reza was born in 1966. Leila, the youngest, arrived in 1970. For Reza, childhood was never supposed to lead to an ordinary adulthood. At his father's coronation in 1967, he was formally presented as Crown Prince. His education included court protocol, languages, history, and military training. He learned to fly while still a teenager. The basic assumption of his upbringing was simple. One day he would become Shah. That assumption shaped the whole family. Reza's position mattered because the Pahlavi monarchy had been built around male succession. The dynasty's future was not an abstract idea. It had a face, a name, and a child being prepared for a throne. But even while the royal children were growing up behind palace walls, the political ground beneath them was changing. Mohammad Reza Shah's reign produced real modernization. Education expanded. Roads, industry, health programs, women's legal rights, and a growing urban middle class changed Iranian society. Supporters of the monarchy still point to those developments. But modernization was paired with an increasingly centralized political system, weak space for legal opposition, corruption around powerful elites, and the feared security service known as SAVAK. Economic growth also brought inflation, social disruption, and widening expectations that the political system could not satisfy. By the late 1970s, opposition came from very different directions at once. Religious conservatives rejected aspects of westernization. Liberals and nationalists opposed authoritarian rule. Leftists attacked inequality and foreign influence. Bazaar merchants, students, clerics, professionals, and workers joined protests for reasons that were not always the same. The movement eventually centered on Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the exiled cleric who had become the most recognizable enemy of the Shah. By the end of 1978, strikes and demonstrations were paralyzing the state. The question inside the palace was no longer whether the monarchy faced opposition. It was whether the monarchy could survive at all. The children began leaving before the final moment. Reza was already in the United States, undergoing advanced flight training at Reese Air Force Base in Texas. The younger members of the family were moved out as the crisis deepened. Then, on January 16, 1979, Mohammad Reza Shah and Farah left Iran. They believed, or at least publicly suggested, that the departure might be temporary. It was not. Less than 3 weeks later, Khomeini returned from exile. On February 11th, the old political order collapsed. In April, the Islamic Republic was proclaimed after a referendum. Royal titles, succession rules, and the legal position that had defined the Shah's children vanished inside Iran. That was the first great reversal. Reza had spent his childhood preparing for a job that no longer existed. Farahnaz, Ali Reza, and Leila had grown up in a household surrounded by security, staff, ceremonies, and the assumption that Iran was home. Suddenly, returning home was not simply difficult. It was dangerous and politically impossible. And the family did not immediately find a new home. The Shah's exile became a restless journey through countries that did not always want the political cost of sheltering him. He and Farah went first to Egypt, then Morocco. From there came the Bahamas, Mexico, the United States, Panama, and finally Egypt again. The children experienced exile differently, but all of them watched a family that had once hosted kings and presidents become dependent on invitations, visas, medical decisions, and governments calculating whether the Shah was worth the trouble. The crisis became international when the Shah was admitted to the United States for cancer treatment in October 1979. In Iran, militants seized the American embassy and held American diplomats hostage. The Shah's presence in the United States became one of the central demands surrounding the crisis. Revolutionary authorities wanted him returned, along with wealth they said belonged to Iran. For the children, the political argument over their father was happening at the same time that he was seriously ill. Mohammad Reza Shah had lymphoma. His condition worsened through the final months of exile. By March 1980, he was back in Egypt, where President Anwar Sadat offered him refuge. On July 27, 1980, the former Shah died in a military hospital in Cairo. The monarchy had been gone for about a year and a half. Now the father at the center of the family was gone too. Egypt gave him a state funeral. The ceremony still carried military honors, uniforms, flags, and the visual language of royalty. But the guest list showed how much had changed. Many governments kept their distance. The man who had once commanded enormous diplomatic attention was buried in Cairo, not Tehran. That funeral became the dividing line in the lives of his children. There was also a second inheritance hanging over the children: money. When the Shah left Iran, revolutionary leaders accused the royal family of taking vast wealth abroad. Contemporary estimates of the Pahlavi fortune varied enormously, from large personal holdings to claims of many billions tied to the wider royal family and the Pahlavi Foundation. Even at the time, outside investigators struggled to separate the Shah's personal assets from foundation holdings, investments, property controlled by relatives, and rumors repeated as fact. That uncertainty matters because it created a myth that would follow the children almost as closely as the crown. The revolution confiscated royal and elite property inside Iran. Palaces, villas, businesses, and foundations were absorbed into the new order or reassigned. But the children were not left destitute. The family had assets and connections abroad. They could afford private education, security, travel, and comfortable lives. So exile produced a strange combination: enormous loss without ordinary poverty. They had lost political power, legal status, homes they could safely return to, much of the physical world of court life, and eventually their father. But they still possessed resources most refugees could never imagine. That contradiction shaped public reactions to their later suffering. Admirers saw a family punished for the politics of a previous generation. Critics saw privileged exiles whose grief should not erase the suffering associated with the monarchy. Both perspectives became part of the Pahlavi story. The children could mourn what they had lost. The public could still ask how that life had been built. Any serious account has to hold both ideas at once. For Shahnaz, the revolution had arrived when she was already an adult with her own history. For Reza, it forced a decision about whether to inherit his father's political claim. For Farahnaz, it opened a long retreat from public life. For Leila and Ali Reza, who were still young, exile became part of their adolescence itself. The eldest, Shahnaz, had always stood slightly apart from the family created by the Shah and Farah. She had grown up between Iranian and Egyptian royal connections and studied in Europe. At 16, she married Ardeshir Zahidi, a rising Iranian diplomat who later became foreign minister and served twice as Iran's ambassador to the United States. They had one daughter, Zara. The marriage ended in divorce in the 1960s. Shahnaz later married Khosrow Jahanbani. With him, she had 2 more children. By the time revolution came, she was not a school-age princess suddenly pulled from a palace. She was a woman in her late 30s with children of her own. That difference mattered. Shahnaz did not become the political face of the dynasty. She did not spend the next 40 years campaigning to restore a throne. After the revolution, she established her life in Switzerland, where she acquired Swiss citizenship. In 2013, she was also granted Egyptian citizenship, a fitting detail for someone whose mother had been born into Egypt's former royal family. Her second husband died in 2014. Shahnaz remained largely outside the political spotlight. In one sense, hers was the quietest outcome. She lost the country in which her father had been king, but she had already built an identity beyond the immediate royal household. Her children grew up outside the structure that had once made their grandfather one of the most powerful rulers in the Middle East. There is an irony here. Shahnaz was born into two royal families. Her father belonged to the Pahlavi monarchy of Iran. Her mother belonged to the Muhammad Ali dynasty of Egypt. Both monarchies disappeared during Shahnaz's lifetime. She inherited royal blood from two states that no longer had kings. But if Shahnaz became the private elder daughter, Reza became the child who could never fully separate his personal life from the vanished throne. When his father died, Reza was 19. Under the old constitution, he could not fully assume the royal role until his 20th birthday. On October 31, 1980, in Cairo, he publicly declared himself the lawful Shah of Iran. The scene was almost the opposite of his father's coronation. There was no Tehran palace, no Iranian state, no army taking an oath to him, no parliament recognizing him. He spoke from exile, with an imperial flag and the memory of a constitution that the new Islamic Republic had already swept aside. The declaration mattered symbolically, but it did not change the political reality. Iran had a new system. The United States said it recognized the government of the Islamic Republic and had no intention of supporting Reza's claim to the throne. So the boy trained to become king faced a new question. If he could not inherit Iran, what exactly had he inherited? At first, the answer was the dynastic claim itself. Supporters continued to call him Crown Prince or Shah. Monarchists saw him as the legal continuation of the Pahlavi line. But over time, Reza's public identity changed. He completed a degree in political science from the University of Southern California. In 1986, he married Yasmin Edamedamini. They eventually had 3 daughters, Noor, Iman, and Farah. That created another dynastic complication. Under the old monarchy's male-centered succession system, daughters did not occupy the same position a son would have. But there was no throne left to inherit anyway. In recent years, Reza has emphasized equal rights between men and women and has treated the old rules less as a binding constitution than as part of a historical legacy. More important was the way his politics evolved. The young man who declared himself Shah in Cairo gradually presented himself less as a monarch waiting to be restored and more as an opposition figure arguing for a secular democratic transition. He built networks among Iranian exiles, spoke to foreign governments and policy groups, and tried repeatedly to bring different anti-Islamic Republic factions together. That has never been easy. Iranian opposition politics outside the country is deeply divided. Monarchists are only one part of it. There are Republicans, leftists, former revolutionaries, ethnic and regional organizations, liberal Democrats, and groups with very different memories of the Pahlavi period. Some Iranians remember the Shah's era as a time of modernization, relative social freedom, and national strength. Others remember political repression, inequality, savik, and the lack of democratic accountability. Reza therefore inherited not only his father's name, but his father's arguments. Every time he appears as a possible leader, the old monarchy returns to the debate with him. Supporters say he has something most opposition figures lack: broad name recognition, a network across the diaspora, and a symbol that predates the Islamic Republic. Critics argue that a famous surname is not the same as an organization inside Iran, and that the son cannot simply detach himself from the political record of the father. Reza has spent decades trying to answer that problem by saying that Iran's future system should be chosen by Iranians, not imposed by a dynasty. He has often said his role is to help create a transition rather than to demand a restored crown. Yet the monarchy question never disappears because many of his most enthusiastic supporters still wave the old lion and sun flag and openly call for a return of the Pahlavis. By 2026, Reza was again one of the most visible figures in the Iranian opposition abroad. But visibility was not the same as control. Reuters reported that his effort to position himself as the leading figure for a political transition had struggled to unite the opposition and had not won formal backing from American leaders. Reza rejected accusations that he was seeking power for himself and insisted that his goal was democratic change. That is where the Crown Prince's story stands. He was trained to inherit a throne, declared himself Shah in exile at 20, then spent most of his adult life arguing that the people should decide what comes after the Islamic Republic. He never returned to live in Iran. He never became king. Reza's position also became more complicated inside his own family. For the old monarchy, succession had been designed around sons. That was why his birth in 1960 had been treated as a national event. It had solved the dynastic problem that had haunted his father's earlier marriages. But Reza and Yasmin had 3 daughters, not sons. If the monarchy still existed under its old constitutional rules, that would have created another succession question. In exile, however, there was no Iranian state institution capable of resolving it. Parliament could not amend a royal constitution that the Islamic Republic did not recognize. A court in exile could make claims, but those claims would have no force inside Iran. This exposed something important about fallen dynasties. A monarchy is not just a family tree. It is a family tree backed by laws, ministries, armed forces, ceremonies, courts, and public institutions. Remove those institutions and succession becomes an argument between private people and political supporters. Reza's daughters therefore grew up with the Pahlavi name but without the machine that once turned that name into power. That may partly explain why Reza's later political language moved away from the old idea of automatic hereditary restoration. The more time passed, the harder it became to pretend that 1979 was a temporary interruption. By the 21st century, most of his public case rested on future consent rather than inherited right. Even among monarchists, that changed the meaning of his role. Some still imagined a constitutional king. Others saw him as a temporary national figure who could help oversee a transition and then let voters decide. Reza himself increasingly emphasized the second idea. The heir had become a man arguing that inheritance alone was not enough. But unlike his siblings, he also never escaped the political meaning of being the Shah's son. Farahnaz took almost the opposite path. She was 15 when the monarchy collapsed. Old enough to understand that her world was disappearing, but still young enough for that collapse to interrupt the ordinary process of becoming an adult. After her father's death, the family gradually established a more stable base in the United States. Farahnaz pursued education rather than politics. She studied social work and later child psychology at Columbia University, earning a bachelor's degree in the 1980s and a master's degree in 1990. Those choices were strikingly different from the role once imagined for a princess in an imperial household. She did not become a political organizer. She did not create a public royal court in exile. She did not marry into another ruling family. Instead, she built a private life and largely disappeared from public view. Her mother later said that Farahnaz had tried to work with international aid organizations, including UNICEF, but had been rejected because of her family name. That account comes from Farah Pahlavi and is difficult to independently verify. But whether or not the name alone closed those doors, the larger problem is believable. The Pahlavi surname was impossible to treat as neutral. For some people it meant monarchy and privilege. For others it meant a lost Iran. For others it meant repression. For Farahnaz it was simply her name. The contrast with Reza could hardly be sharper. His name became his profession. Hers became something she seemed to protect herself from. For years, the public saw Farahnaz mainly at family ceremonies, memorials, and moments of grief. She remained close to her mother and siblings, especially as tragedy narrowed the family. Then, in May 2026, there was a rare reminder that private did not mean disconnected. Reuters photographed Farahnaz at a pro-monarchy rally in New York supporting her brother's political movement. After decades of silence, The Shah's elder daughter was still there, not as a rival claimant or public leader, but as part of a family that had never completely separated itself from the question of Iran. If Farahnaz turned inward, the two youngest children carried the most painful part of the story. Leila was only 8 when her father left Iran and 9 when the monarchy was formally gone. She had spent her earliest years surrounded by the certainty of palace life. Then, within roughly 18 months, she lost her country, her home, the political identity of her family, and her father. Childhood exile is not just a change of address. It can mean losing the place that explains who you are before you are old enough to build another identity. Leila grew up in the United States, attended school there, and later studied at Brown University. She spoke several languages and moved easily through elite social circles in Europe and America. For a time, she also modeled for the designer Valentino. From the outside, the life still looked privileged. There were hotels, travel, famous friends, expensive clothes, and a family name recognized around the world. But privilege did not erase dislocation. Leila struggled for years with serious health problems, including depression and eating disorders. Accounts from people around her described a young woman who had difficulty finding stability and who moved between the United States and Europe. Her story became inseparable from the question of exile because she herself had spoken about wanting to see Iran again. She never did. On June 10, 2001, Leila Pahlavi was found dead in a London hotel room. She was 31. The first reports were confused. Her family said she had suffered from a lengthy illness. Police initially said there were no suspicious circumstances. Later toxicology and an inquest established that she had died after taking a dangerous combination of drugs, including a large quantity of sleeping medication. The Westminster coroner recorded a verdict of death from non-dependent drug abuse. It is important not to rewrite that verdict into something more certain than the evidence allowed. Leila was buried in Passy Cemetery in Paris, near her maternal grandmother. The geography of the Pahlavi family was now becoming a map of exile. The father lay in Cairo. The youngest daughter lay in Paris. The surviving children were spread across Europe and the United States. Tehran, the place that had defined all of them, remained absent. Leila's death changed the family. Farah later said she began writing her memoir in the aftermath of losing her daughter. Reza spoke publicly of deep grief. Ali Reza, Leila's older brother, was hit especially hard. And 10 years later, the family faced the same kind of phone call again. Ali Reza had been 12 when the revolution overthrew his father. Unlike Reza, he had not been raised as the primary heir. That difference gave him more freedom, but it also left him with a less defined role after exile. He turned toward scholarship. Ali Reza studied at Princeton, then completed graduate work at Columbia in fields connected to Iranian history and culture. He later pursued doctoral studies at Harvard in ancient Iranian studies and philology. Friends and scholars remembered him as more interested in history, music, and the civilization of Iran than in the daily politics that consumed his older brother. This made his life another kind of answer to exile. Reza tried to recover political relevance. Ali Reza tried to recover Iran intellectually. The country he could not physically return to became an object of study. He researched its ancient languages, history, and culture. In a family built by a modern 20th century monarchy, he was drawn much further back, toward civilizations that had existed long before the Pahlavis and would remain part of Iranian identity long after them. But academic purpose did not protect him from personal pain. Ali Reza struggled with depression. Family members and friends later spoke about the weight of losing his father, his homeland, and then his sister Leila. On January 4, 2011, Ali Reza Pahlavi died by suicide at his home in Boston. He was 44. The news produced an unusual reaction because even many Iranians who had no sympathy for the monarchy recognized the human tragedy. Political arguments did not disappear, but for a moment they stood beside something simpler. A mother had lost a second child, and the surviving siblings had lost another member of a family already shaped by rupture. The story might have ended there. Instead, 7 months later, it changed again. On July 26, 2011, a girl named Leila Pahlavi was born in Boston. She was the daughter of Ali Reza and his partner, Raha Daidvar. Her father had died before she was born. Her middle name, Leila, carried the memory of the aunt who had died 10 years earlier. For Farah Pahlavi, the birth had an obvious emotional meaning. After losing a daughter and a son, she now had a granddaughter who connected both names. A memorial fellowship in ancient Iranian studies was also established in Ali Reza's name, linking his legacy to the academic work that had mattered to him. That may be the most unexpected form of survival in the entire family. The Pahlavi dynasty did not survive through the mechanism it had been designed for.
No son inherited a functioning throne.
No palace court continued abroad. No government recognized an imperial succession with legal power over Iran. Instead, what survived were people, names, memories, private families, political arguments, and institutions with much smaller purposes. That difference helps explain what really happened to the Shah's 5 children. Shahnaz became the private elder daughter in Switzerland, a woman born into 2 vanished monarchies who chose no major political role. Reza became the permanent heir to a throne that does not exist, first proclaiming himself Shah in exile and later reinventing himself as an opposition advocate who says Iran's future should be decided democratically. Farahnaz built a quiet life around education and family, appearing publicly only rarely, though even decades later she remained connected to her brother and to monarchist circles. Leila grew up between America and Europe, struggled with severe health problems, and died in London at 31. Ali Reza pursued scholarship on Iran's ancient past, lived mostly outside politics, and died by suicide in Boston at 44, leaving behind a daughter born after his death. 5 children. 5 very different answers to the same historical disaster. But there is another question hiding underneath all of them. Did the revolution actually destroy the Pahlavi family? Politically, it destroyed the system that gave the family power. The monarchy was abolished. Royal property inside Iran was seized or transferred by the revolutionary state. The legal privileges of the dynasty disappeared. The title of Shah became, at most, a claim used by supporters outside the country. Yet the family did not become ordinary in the full sense either. They retained international connections and financial resources. They moved through elite universities and social networks. Their surname continued to open some doors and close others. They were never simply anonymous refugees. The surviving siblings also experienced something that is common in exiled political families but rarely visible from the outside. They had to keep redefining what counted as home. Cairo held their father's grave and the memory of President Sadat's protection. The United States offered schools, universities, professional life, and a large Iranian diaspora. France offered cultural familiarity and a place where Farah spent significant time. Switzerland offered Shahnaz privacy and stability. Iran remained the emotional center of the story, but it was the one country in which the Shah's children could not simply build an ordinary household. That produced a family culture built around visits rather than residence. Birthdays, funerals, memorials, political meetings, and weddings pulled relatives together across borders. Then they separated again. For the younger children especially, this meant that family memory often had to substitute for physical continuity. The Iran of their childhood existed in photographs, Persian conversation, food, music, stories, old staff, family friends, and annual rituals around their father's death. The farther they moved from 1979, the more Iran became both a real country and a remembered place. Those are not always the same thing. That is important because stories about fallen royalty often swing between 2 fantasies. One says the family lost everything and became poor. The other says nothing really changed because they remained wealthy. Neither captures what happened here. The Pahlavis lost the one thing money could not replace: a state that recognized their position. They could still have homes, education, travel, and influence. They could not make Iran call them royal. That distinction is the governing fact behind every child's life after 1979. For Shahnaz, it meant her title became private history. For Farahnaz, it meant the family name could become a burden in an ordinary professional world. For Ali Reza and Leila, it meant growing up with memories of a place they could not safely go back to. For Reza, it meant spending an entire adult life trying to convert inherited symbolism into political legitimacy. And that has proven much harder than inheriting a crown. A crown can be transferred by law. Legitimacy has to be accepted by people who were never asked to inherit the same memories. This is why Reza Pahlavi remains both significant and controversial. Among some Iranians, especially parts of the diaspora and younger people who did not live under his father, the Pahlavi name can represent a secular alternative to the Islamic Republic or a remembered period of stability and modernization. Among others, the same name carries the history of authoritarian rule, the 1953 coup against Prime Minister Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and a monarchy they do not want restored. The children inherited both versions. They could not choose only the flattering one. Nor could the Islamic Republic erase the family completely by abolishing its titles. The name survived because Iran's modern history never reached a simple emotional settlement with the monarchy it overthrew. That is why images of Reza Pahlavi can still draw crowds and anger almost half a century later. It is also why a rare appearance by Farahnaz can become news. The family remains a screen onto which Iranians project competing ideas of the country they lost, the country they rejected, and the country they hope might come next. But the most revealing legacy may not be political at all. Look at the family geographically. Mohammad Reza Shah is buried in Cairo. Leila is buried in Paris. Ali Reza died in Boston. Shahnaz built her post-revolution life in Switzerland. Farahnaz spent much of hers in the United States. Reza built a political career from exile and raised daughters who have never known Iran as the country their grandfather ruled. The dynasty that once placed itself at the center of the Iranian state became a family of airports, passports, foreign schools, memorial services, and long-distance memories. That is the real status inversion. In the 1970s, their problem was how to live inside a palace without being overwhelmed by the machinery of monarchy. After 1979, their problem was how to live without the country that made the palace meaningful. Some adapted by becoming private. One adapted by becoming political. Two never found a stable enough answer. And the next generation inherited the name without inheriting the life that once came with it. Reza's three daughters, Noor, Aman and Farah, grew up in the United States. Ali Reza's daughter Iriana was born after her father's death. They are descendants of the last Shah, but not heirs in the practical sense that shaped Reza's childhood. They have no state office waiting for them, no official palace school, no constitutional role in Iran. Their connection to royalty is historical, familial, and symbolic. In that sense, the Pahlavi story has entered a third generation. The first generation lost power. The second had to survive the loss. The third has to decide what the name means when power is only a memory. That may ultimately be the answer to what happened to the Shah's 5 children. The revolution did not produce one clean ending. Produced 5 afterlives. Shahnaz found distance. Reza found a mission. Farahnaz found privacy. Leila found no lasting peace. Ali Reza found scholarship, but not enough peace to survive his own pain. And after all the flags, titles, palaces, accusations, nostalgia, and political campaigns, the family's most durable inheritance may be something far more ordinary than a crown. Memory. A father's tomb in Cairo. A daughter's grave in Paris. A fellowship carrying a son's name. A granddaughter born too late to meet her father. And an heir, now an older man, still speaking about a country he left as a teenager. The Peacock Throne did not pass from father to son. Passed into history. The children were left to carry everything else. Which fallen royal family should we follow next?